Whew, the Golden Stallion here with you for, well, we've got something a little special to do today. Something that I know people love, and that are the book reviews that get done. Used to be done in Sovryn Tech Prime episodes, usually during the climax or something like that. But now I can actually really take my time with them. Not that I'm going to take a ton of time. I don't expect this really to go beyond 30 minutes if it even goes that long. But, you know, now that I can take my time on Patreon, it's a lot more enjoyable to do book reviews where I don't feel so constrained to fit it into like 10 to 15 minutes, which is usually what the climax will last for, sometimes even less than that. So this book review is going to be, well, you probably saw the title of the episode, so you know what it is, but it's going to be about a book that I was very, very excited about to come out, like really, really excited. And it's a very new book. This book just came out in the United States. It just came out the beginning of May of 2018, so it's not even really a month old at the point of me posting this. And, well, it's a book that, I mean, certainly controversial. The book is called The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli, who is an Italian physicist who can speak English, by the way, but he doesn't usually write in English. And I think he might have. So if you have heard Carlo Rovelli's name before, The Order of Time itself is what would be a pop sci book, right? A popular science book. He has written two others. Two other more popular science books. The first one being 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, which was originally written in 2015, but I don't think it came out in English, or at least to the States, until 2017. Very short book, and it's 7 brief lessons, and it's not kidding, and they are brief, and it is a brilliant, brilliant book. If you listen to the audiobook, you can listen to the audiobook inside of a couple hours, I think, and Carlo Rovelli actually reads it himself because it is so short. In fact, I think it's less than a couple of hours for the audiobook. But a very well done book and a great way to get up to speed. In fact, it was so popular, I think it's what inspired Neil deGrasse Tyson to release his book Astrophysics for People in a Hurry, because he wanted a piece of that action. Because clearly, based on the millions of copies that 7 Brief Lessons on Physics sold in the United States, obviously there's a market for that sort of thing. But I'll tell you, while Neil deGrasse Tyson is certainly, I think he's actually a great communicator of science. I don't agree with him on everything. There's a lot of things, oh boy. But he is a good communicator on science. I actually don't think he's as good as Carlo Rovelli. Carlo Rovelli is downright poetic in what he does. It's pretty remarkable. His other book that he released as well, and this one did come out this came out in 2016, which is Reality is Not What It Seems, The Journey to Quantum Gravity. Now that's an interesting read as well, mainly because it gets you into one of his major areas of research, which is quantum loop gravity, and which also leads to quantum loop cosmology, which I'm not going to get into those subjects right now, but basically they are ways to, kind of really, it's been the never-ending search of the past 100 years of how do we really reconcile classical physics with quantum physics. Not necessarily a TOE. I don't think that Carlo Rovelli would be going for a theory of everything, but just how do these two, come together in more of a way than just describing it with emergence, which is the explanation. Which emergence is that that something can be more than the sum of its parts. Okay, that's basically emergence. And emergence is a scientific concept. It's a philosophical concept as well. It gets applied all over the place, meaning that just because something has certain properties when it is at a certain scale, when it gets to a larger scale, it can take on wholly new properties. Just like humans are much more than the sum of their parts, right? We're 70% water, all this other stuff, but we don't just operate under the properties that are water, of course, right? We function on a significantly higher level. That's emergence. But, to kind of go beyond that, to really reconcile these two sciences that's where quantum loop gravity comes in, and a way to explain gravity, because that's, those are things that are still getting hammered out in the halls of science, as it were. And by the way, sorry, it's loop quantum gravity. I keep saying quantum loop. I'm just getting it backwards. It's okay. Loop quantum gravity and loop quantum cosmology. So without a doubt, Carlo Rovelli is a brilliant guy. Just a brilliant, brilliant guy. And like I said, I really like his style. I really like his writing. It is very poetic. Of course, it's getting translated from Italian, But I don't think anything gets lost in the translation, and he can speak English, so he'd know if it was getting lost in the translation and what he did. Fortunately, when it gets translated into the English, it keeps its poetic style. Because, I really think that, well, I'm inclined to agree with Heinrich von Schlegel, which was, where he said, every art should become science and every science should become art. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And Carlo Rovelli, in the book Order of Time, which is all about what the hell is time, he hits at that throughout the book. Again, that poetic nature, he even hints on the, how important poetry is. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from the book, and we'll get into what the book says and what I think about it. Okay. But here's the quote from Carlo Rovelli. Rebellion is perhaps among the deepest roots of science, the refusal to accept the present order of things. And perhaps poetry is another of the deepest roots of science, the capacity to see beyond the visible. Now, I love that. Now, let's understand, Carlo Rovelli isn't a religious guy, not really, as far as I know anyway. But I get his point. I mean, and so I think it's so important to have people that do, and I've talked about this on recent Sovryn Tech Prime episodes. In fact, I remember there was a best episode where it was me, Stephanie, and Ellen. And we were talking about sex education, sex ed in schools, and how, it's so dry and so, kind of sterile and just, there's nothing, it's telling you what sex is, but it's not giving you the why. And I had said in that, I was like, well, that's because the next page should just be all poetry. Explain why you want to do that. And I think that's true across the sciences. Explain the why. Why is this so wonderful? Why is this so beautiful? Because I think poetry is it's the original way humans used to communicate, poetry and song. They're very related. And I think that without it, our brains don't exactly wrap their heads around what's being explained. And that's one of the beautiful things about this book that I'm going to say outright again, is that it is beautifully, wonderfully written. And it comes across, it's not, it is, the book is a mindfuck. I'll say that straight. It is an absolute mindfuck. But at the same time, it's not Carlo Rovelli isn't using isn't using a lot of technical terms. It's a book that just about anybody can sink their teeth into, in my opinion, even though it's really going to mess with your head with a lot of its premises. But it's not from a lack of understanding. He uses very, I think, logical, reasoned arguments in explaining everything. He gives you plenty of background to understand what's going on, gives you history behind it, which history is as important in explaining things and understanding things, even though history would be kind of an odd concept for what Rovelli is putting into the Order of Time. But he does use history, goes back to figures like Aristotle and, of course, Isaac Newton, Anaximander, and, Einstein, of course, and it goes down the list of it. But that's important, as much important to use as it is to use, I think, poetic language and explanation within things. So it's a stunning book. And I'll tell you, the audiobook, which just came out at the same time when it was the ebook or the paperback was released in the United States. The audiobook is read by Benedict Cumberbatch. You know how golden that voice is, and how, and it's I think you can listen to it in 4 hours. That's at 1x. You listen to it at 2x, you get it done inside of 2 hours. But it's a brilliant, brilliant book. I can't say I'm going to get into what the book says, but I want to get this out of the way in front. So yeah, it's a shorter book, but I'm really still wrapping my head around a lot of what he's saying in it. And the basic premise of the book is that you have two concepts of time. And I might not be exactly using his terms on this, but there is true time, which is what Newton more or less came up with, which is the idea that there is this time that is objective, that stands outside and is always kind of ticking, okay? Or you could call it clock time, like it's the time that you think you're measuring with a clock. Notice key word or key phrase, you think you're measuring with a clock. But then there's relativistic time, which is more, something from Einstein, which is that, Einstein would make the claim that, well, the person who lives on top of a mountain is technically older than the person who lives at sea level. Or the clock that sits on top of a table is telling a different time than the clock that sits on the floor. Okay. It's further along in time the higher that you go up. And that's, that's one of the basic ideas behind the theory of relativity. That's where it gets the name relativity. And Rovelli's basic point is that Einstein was very much right in that there isn't a true time. There isn't a clock time. There isn't this objective idea, or again, objective. There isn't an objective idea of time. Time is something that we experience in what he would say is a blurred fashion. Okay. And for example, how he explains this. So under the concept of a true time, okay, you have these, and this is tough because so many, and this is a problem with the conversation of time all the way around, because actually there's another book that I would like to review in the near future, which is, it was a History of Time Travel by James Gleick, or Time Travel, a History, I think that's what it's called. And I'd love to go over that because James Gleick explains, who's brilliant. He also wrote Chaos, A New Science, that's a classic. He makes a great case makes the case that like the concepts of time and like even just traveling through time, not necessarily even in the H.G. Wells sense, but like the time machine, but just in general, like a lot of languages can't handle that. They don't know what to do with that, right? And so, well, at least that's the evidence that he puts forward. Okay. So even in English, when we use terms like past, present, future, which is what I was just about to say, when you use terms like past, present, future, well, to a lot of people, those mean a lot of different things. A lot of the words that we use for the passage of time or the measurement of time, have a ton of different meanings, so you're already running into a problem with that. But I think you get my point in that, usually how we think about time, how we think about clock time is that there is the past, which is, say 5 minutes ago when the hand was on the 6 instead of the, when the clock hand was on the 6 instead of the 7. And there's the present or now, you could also use the term now for the present, which is whatever the clock says. And then there is the future, which is, say, if the clock hand is on the 7, well, in the future, it'll be on the 8. Okay. So, but these concepts are, to Rovelli, he just calls them bullshit. And he starts off with the concept of now. And really, once you deconstruct the concept of now, past and future fall apart. But there's something to the past. We'll talk about what that has to do with in just a second, okay? But his deconstruction of now is that now is consistently relative. There is no objective now, okay? When you see an event happen, or even when you're looking at the clock, it takes a certain amount of time. Granted, it can be, nanoseconds, whatever, but it takes a certain amount of time for the photons, the light from what you're seeing to get to your eyes. So what's now? Like, because if everything takes time to get to your eyes, you're not actually seeing now. You're seeing what he would, again, label a blurred vision of now, because now only happens in the space where the event occurred. Of course, that's another point that he makes overall, is that there's really just events in life. There's not actual like time or even really things. Everything is just an event, based upon this perspective of the idea that we just have, again, a blurred vision of what now is. In fact, a great example that he gives in the book is he says that, let's say Earth or, humans colonize the nearest next habitable planet. And he uses the example of Proxima b, right, which is so many light years away. Okay. And he says that, if, say, your friend went to Proxima b, granted, would you still be alive when your friend got there? Well, again, this gets into all the, the crazy business about time where, suddenly you're just, your eyes start rolling behind your head. And, he goes into it and he says, like, all right, say somebody's on Proxima b and they're doing something now. If you ask them, say somehow you could find out what they were doing right then, are you really finding out what they're doing right then? No, you're finding out what they did, 10 years ago or however long it would take the message to get to, to Earth. And so like now these concepts are all relative, right? And you got to, the way that he explains it, he does a far better job of describing this stuff than I could. But the point being is that, even that person, say they traveled back to Earth, at, I don't know, whatever, the speed of light or something around those times. There'd be different ages. The whole thing, which again is all basic, basic relativity. But the example of, what a person on Proxima B is doing now compared to what you're doing and how you can experience it, okay, it works just as well if somebody is across the room with you. Say somebody cuts their finger. This isn't an example he gives. I'm just coming up with one. If somebody cuts their finger, you see it happen. You saw what happened, however many nanoseconds ago, right? Or you didn't actually, because it took that time for the photons to get to you, you couldn't experience it at the very instant that it happened. Only the person that's there could experience it then. Now, this isn't saying there isn't an objective reality. That's not what Rovelli is getting at. But he's making the point that our experience of time is very skewed, and our concepts of it have been, and certainly the way that they've developed within our languages, are also problematic at best. Or like he likes to say, they are blurred. So there are, and if I'm doing him wrong, if I'm doing him dirty here, Rovelli, forgive me. Okay. But the basic, but I get the concept. Okay. Just a lot of people don't like to think about it. But the basic idea is that things happening around you, you never experience them in the now. You can't. It's impossible. Okay. You never really experience, and this is true. This is where, this is one of the basics behind the concept of emergence, is that really when you get to certain scales, when you get to very large scales and very small scales, what we think of, the way we think about things, mathematically and whatever, and the order that we think things have, completely break down. They just totally break down. Right. There is an order to things in a way, but entropy. Okay, let's get into that. So here's the thing. If there's anything that points at an arrow of time, it is entropy itself. Okay. It's second law of thermodynamics is that there are things that get, less hot or less cold, depending upon which way you want to look at it. Heat traverses. And that's about the only thing you can look at that gives you any kind of concept of, say, like the past, right? Because, well, at one point, this object was, because of the second law of thermodynamics, this was warmer or this was colder. Now that's no longer true. That's about the only thing that you can really point at. Okay. But at the same time, a lot of that, boils down to an experience. And this is where some people, I think, could actually start to diverge from what he's saying and saying, okay, yeah, well, but you're admitting that there might be some actual concept of time because of the second law of thermodynamics, because of entropy. Okay, things falling into disorder, which is, it's the nature of things. Sorry, government. Woo. But if you were to criticize Rovelli's conclusion that time is meaningless, and that everything's space-time, which you'd also be arguing against, well, well, that's where you would do it from, okay? But the point I was going to bring up is that here's the thing, is that Einstein had changed his mind a couple times, right? And so you can point at, a certain time frame, like one decade of Einstein and then another decade of Einstein, and you can end up with, kind of two theories at certain points. But he writes about it when he thinks that he's wrong. But then also there's things where Einstein thought he was wrong that later on, scientists would figure out, oh, actually he was right in the past and he ended up being wrong in the future. And then is there a past and future? Blah, 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 blah. Right. And, it's funny because, when you get to this, again, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense what Rovelli is saying. It sounds very reasonable. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's right, because a lot of physicists can say things that are reasonable, but like Carl Sagan would say, intellectual brilliance is no guarantee from being dead wrong. All right. So, again, I'm still chewing on a lot of what Rovelli has to say, but, this was a big deal. Einstein's theory of relativity, which is everything that Rovelli's basing all this off of, they used to be called the Jewish lie in Nazi Germany. That was called Jewish science, and they thought it was, more or less of the devil. Catholic Church, not much farther off. It smacks of Galileo with all this stuff. But they really used to this shit was punishable by death. In fact, consider that in Nazi Germany, or, well, just consider today. In fact, Stephanie says this to me all the time, which is ironic. She says that, I keep time like a German train. Germans are really big on this clock time, right? In fact, they were so big on it. And I'm not comparing today's Germans to Nazi Germany, not at all. I'm just saying that there's this past, there's this history. Sorry, Rovelli. I mean, Rovelli's not saying these things didn't happen. He's just saying that like it's not something measurable by a clock, not at the end of the day, or not at the end of the day. See, this is the thing. It's just so baked into our language. It's hard to even like think outside of it to what actually is time. Is time even a thing other than just space time? I mean, and look, I've argued for this stuff for a while. Like I love the quote from Rocky 3, where Apollo Creed says there is no tomorrow. And I said it years ago on Sovryn Tech. I said, well, that's actually an accurate statement. There is no tomorrow. Even though I say at the same time, I say be the future. Language fail. It's something that it doesn't get enough treatment in our philosophical arguments, quite frankly. But anyway, so I get told that I keep things, I keep time like a German clock, because I always wear a watch and I'm very much on time. I'm one of those guys. If you're not 15 minutes early or 5 minutes late, all those concepts, right? Well, I mean, and that reputation comes from something, because Germans are really big on this clock time, and they always have been. And when they heard the theory of relativity, I mean, they thought that was, I mean, they wrapped that right up in the Jewish conspiracy, and it didn't help that it came from Einstein, right? A well-known Jew. So, well, while there were some, German scientists that got it, that understood what was being laid out and could think ahead on that. There were German scientists at the time that were absolutely brilliant, but they just, their brains would not allow them to consider that clock time was bullshit. Just wouldn't. And so this is a very tough pill to swallow when you read this book. I'm glad that it's brief. I'm glad, which again is describing a passage of time. I'm glad that it doesn't take long to listen to. Just described it again. Do you see how hard this is? And when you listen to the book, like you'll get it. And fortunately, if you read it, you can read it too, and it doesn't take long either. You don't have to just listen to the audiobook, though Benedict Cumberbatch does a tremendous job as far as presenting the info. But ironically and humbly, I think, Rovelli, at the end of it, even though he calls bullshit on our concepts of time, he more or less comes to the conclusion that maybe because of our blurred perception of what time is, again, because we never really, there is no now, we don't experience the now, according to Rovelli, maybe we can never really understand what he would call the riddle of time. Maybe we can't get it, okay? I think his arguments are very compelling. I think that his science, his research, is pretty spot. It's pretty spot on. But also at the same time, there isn't a, I mean, the puns are just endless. There isn't really like necessarily a hard conclusion. It reminds me very much of Alfred Korzybski's work. And it was the first thing that came to me when I started, or, when I finished the book, and actually while I was going through it, which, like general semantics. Okay. In Korzybski's work with general semantics, his basic idea with that is that also, like, your perceptions are all relative. Like, it really smacks of what Korzybski was saying. And what Korzybski would mean by that, and of course, out of Alfred Korzybski's work, would be you'd end up with like languages like E prime, which is the idea that you get rid of the conjugate to be, like there is no is, things like this. Not that necessarily, I mean, okay, well, let me finish up with Korzybski, because there's a question about objective reality that comes up with this. So with general semantics, the idea is that, of course, in general semantics, there wouldn't be an is. Holy fuck. You know how hard it is to communicate this shit? I give total credit to these people that can do it. So what Korzybski would say is that, you can like say, and this is the example that I use when I'm telling people about general semantics. Okay. Let's say a tank is rolling down the street. Okay. And, I'm 6'1", and let's say the person next to me, the gal next to me is 5 foot. Okay. The gal next to me says that is, that tank is huge, or, that tank is really tall. But then me being 6'1", no, the tank's not that tall, like maybe a foot taller than me, but it's not that tall, right? I wouldn't call it tall. And that's where general semantics come in, is that if a person says the tank is tall, that's based upon the fact that they're like 5 foot, it's in comparison to their perception. which, bears out of their, genetic lottery, frankly, in this case. Okay. As to where, to me, it's not, the tank is not that tall, because in my genetic lottery, I'm 6'1". And so it's very different. And that's where the danger of using the conjugate to be comes in, is that there is a subjective quality to how we describe things in language when we have, conjugate verbs, when you use the word is, when, all these other things, when you're describing this sort of stuff, as to where without to be, you would be describing it the way you would use the language, and this is what E prime is based around. And by the way, if you want to learn about E prime, go to books.zog.ninja. I released personally. I bought it all, got it all professionally scanned. I released personally the entire collection of E prime books that have come out, essays over the past 30 years. And I also put up some of Alfred Korzybski's major works that are available there from the Institute of General Semantics, because they're never going to put half the shit in ebook form. So I will. Okay. And I did. So go ahead and you can download those and share them around and have a great time, but get ready for, much like Order of Time, they're not as poetic, but you're in for a mindfuck all the same. Okay. So with general semantics, I mean, like that really does, that fits in with this idea, and E prime would try to have you speak in such a way in the English language, but in such a way that you are clarifying that you are describing something based upon your perception. Now, just because there's no now and we have a blurred concept of time according to Rovelli, and just because things are subjective perhaps based upon our own biology and experience and whatever else, neither Korzybski, I mean, he may be hinting at this, but I don't think necessarily that it has to be so. Neither Korzybski nor Rovelli are saying there isn't an objective reality, that there isn't an objective space-time. Okay, they're not arguing against that. All right. In fact, both of them would use Einstein in their arguments. Okay. Even though, like I said, you can kind of fudge things with Einstein if you really try. You can use him to prove just about anything. To grab a quote here and there out of context, or and that's important. Context is very important, especially with stuff that Einstein did, because so much of his, even like his personal correspondence, has been preserved. There's times where he's writing to people to console them over a death in their life. And, he's not being scientifically accurate in what he said, but people could use the quote and they say, oh, well, Einstein said this. Well, yeah, but he was trying to console somebody. Okay. Just like, people do that all the time. I mean, I don't believe in a God, but when there's a death around, sometimes I use, religious terms that could be seen as religious or spiritual, but they're, I'm not religious or spiritual at all. And so, how dare you quote me and use those quotes to bolster your arguments when, we're talking about a very sad, and tragic moment. And that's the thing, is that with Einstein, you can pull a lot of stuff out of context because we have so much of his writing. So anyway, Korzybski and Rovelli, both of these, like, it really reminded me of Korzybski's work. But again, neither of those, neither general semantics or loop quantum gravity, okay, or, this concept of time, relativistic time, not true time, that Rovelli is pushing, neither of them are saying there isn't an objective reality. There certainly is. It's just that objective reality, you're experiencing it in either subjective or, in Rovelli's terms, perhaps blurred ways. Okay. It's not the argument, because I get so sick of this shit where people are like, people that are against scientific materialism, where they pretty much say, well, your perception creates reality. And no, reality is itself. Okay. Reality creates you. You'd have no perception without reality. Go shit yourself. Okay. But anyway, it's really, like I said, Rovelli's The Order of Time, it's a tremendous book. It's going to have you thinking forever. It doesn't exactly have like a 100% conclusive answer, but that's okay. But I think it is saying that our concepts that we do have may be at fault, may be a problem, and we need to do something about that. Okay. But again, the entire scientific community, of course, it's like any other community. Not everybody agrees, and that's a beautiful, wonderful thing. Again, I'm still wrapping my head around it. I've had conversations with both Stephanie and Ellen about it, and I think everybody's kind of wrapping their head around it. But yeah, I mean, it is a really strong case, this concept, like, because it just, just breaking it down to the photons and at the Planck scale and everything. I mean, like, now does not exist, right? There is no now. Or if you want to take it another way, I mean, like, now is all that ever exists and there's no past and no future. But even then, like, now only exists for you, and what's happening around you isn't exactly a now. It's just a series of events, that occur. There aren't really like things, because everything you experience is a matter of photons coming towards you and all that. Or not everything, but most, right? So if I did a horrendous job of describing this, I apologize, but I think I got it down. And I was, and I'm trying to make it very layman. I'm not trying to go into, just like he kept it layman. I recommend this book to everybody to read or listen to. It's a beautiful listen if you want to listen to it. I think it's just a tremendous, tremendous book. I was really, really, really excited. I'd read a review about it in Nature about a month before it was coming out, I think. And I was, the guy that did the review in Nature didn't agree with it, but I was like, oh shit, no, I got to read this because, I'm a big stickler on this. And if you've listened to Sovryn Tech episodes over the years, you know it. I say there isn't time, there's space time. It's one thing. And, that gets warped by gravity, right? It's like like things are all rubber sheets and gravity is doing its pull. I'm really like space-time. You have to think about things in that way. And when you do get to conclusions either similar or exactly like what Carlo Rovelli is laying out in The Order of Time. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to take a second because there's something, this is a theory of mine. It's not a popular theory. And as far as I know, it's kind of my own theory. Like I haven't heard a whole lot of other people bring this up. So if you know what, and this isn't, Carlo Rovelli doesn't bring this up in The Order of Time at all. This is totally on me, but I think it bolsters perhaps this idea that, this idea isn't unique to me, but the idea that, past, present, future, like that, it's all, poppycock. It doesn't really, those concepts don't, or those abstractions don't really exist. Okay. And the idea comes from our most ancient concepts of time, or in my opinion, what I think humans' most ancient concepts of time are, perhaps before humans really had like serious codified language. Okay. Maybe they had some kind of language, but certainly they didn't have like a written language that was maybe so much codified, or it was just at the beginning of becoming codified. You have to consider that, it was just a few thousand years ago that really seemingly out of nowhere, you end up with writing. Okay. Language was there, sure. It pretty much had to be, but writing itself, cuneiform in Sumerian, or even the incredibly complex writing that is hieroglyphs, like in ancient Egypt, and etc. And it's amazing too, because we can't really find, and it makes sense. Like I can kind of explain why maybe we can't find those things. It is weird that we really don't, that we don't get proto-languages. Okay. Sometimes we get proto-languages. Like there is such a thing as, say, Proto-Hebrew. Okay, which Hebrew is a very complex language, but you can find kind of its original, there's older forms where you can find that. When you look at, hieroglyphs, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, you don't really get, there aren't proto-hieroglyphs, right? Other than you could say cave paintings are, which is actually something I want to bring up here. You don't really get that. Okay. Same with cuneiform. In the Fertile Crescent particularly, you don't have like proto-cuneiform to take it, to say, okay, well, this is where it came from and when it started and how long ago we really started writing. It just kind of pops up out of nowhere, which is remarkable, in itself. But regardless, there was writing of a type, symbology, that was being used obviously by prehistoric humans that. Well, there does seem to be a trend, perhaps a uniformity, though some of it's so basic, it could just be something that people use similarly, but it had completely different meanings based upon what tribe or, what geographical area, people in a geographical area were using it for. And these are what you call petroglyphs, right? Where it's, not, so you have like geoglyphs, okay, where geoglyphs are, where you make, like you think of the Nazca lines, where you make a gigantic, some kind of symbol or art that, when you look down from the sky or you look at it from, like, say, the side of a mountain or something like that, it ends up making this huge picture, which those are very interesting in themselves. But relax, it's not aliens. But petroglyphs are, that on a much smaller scale, where you're just, like pretty much cave art are petroglyphs, okay, where it's just, it's carvings into stone and things like this that have been around for tens of thousands of years, and that humans have been doing, long before civilization, etc. So there's a very commonplace petroglyph called the spiral. Very simple, and it's exactly what exactly what the name means. You see spirals, and all over the world you see these spirals, and certainly throughout Europe and even into the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent, areas like this, you have, where this symbol is used, and it's used in, all kinds of things. Either it's just a bunch of them drawn onto a stone or carved into a stone, or it's a spiral symbol used in really, really ancient, sculpture, like really ancient sculpture. And there's a lot of different theories as to what these spirals mean. Now, real quick, I didn't say what I thought, and just because maybe there's points where the spiral isn't used so much, or you don't see it so much, I just want to bring up that certainly, like, if there's a reason why we don't have some of those proto-languages, like perhaps in Egypt we don't have the like the proto-hieroglyphs or something, that could very easily be because, the Egyptians came into Egypt, or, well, whatever the Egyptians were, the people that would later become the Egyptians maybe came into Egypt or something, and they could have easily, or maybe not so easily, but they could have just erased every possible trace of what was left of, or what they originally got the writing of hieroglyphs from. Because that happens, right, where a culture comes in and they try to assimilate it and take it over as their own when you don't realize maybe it belonged to a previous culture. You think of like the pantheon of gods between Greece and Rome and things like this, where there's kind of a covering up or an assimilation that occurs into the coming dominant culture. So, that's where that could come from. And just like, these spirals that I'm talking about, if there's areas of the world where maybe they're not, they could have very easily, or they could have been, erased or gotten rid of or something like that. Or, maybe they weren't carved into stone so much and carved into, cave walls. So a lot of people talk about these spirals, and the most common answer for what they are is that usually they will represent water. That's like the common archaeological answer for that, because, if you throw a stone into water, it makes that ripple effect, right? And so this is kind of a drawing of that ripple effect. And there's other explanations around why exactly they say that. Now, when you get into more of the ancient astronaut theorists, okay, or the ancient aliens guys and gals, they want to make a claim that somehow our ancient ancestors knew about galaxies, like that the spiral is somehow representative of the Milky Way or something, and the reason why some rocks have tons of these spirals all over them is because, they're drawing the universe. But how did they know about the universe? Blah, blah, blah. I don't know that I agree with that. And my actual answer for what I think the spiral is might make you think, well, you don't have as much evidence either, but I would argue differently. Anyway, another common thing is just that it's representative of creation. A lot of people say in religions that that's what it means. There's a bunch of different answers for this stuff, but my personal opinion, what these spirals mean and why they're so commonplace is because they are representative of time, and they are a spiral, not a straight line. Okay, they don't work like a clock. Interestingly, there are spirals that go clockwise, and there are spirals that go counterclockwise. There's definitely thought put into these things. And could that be representative of, traveling through time or traveling through the concept of space-time? Because I do believe that, and I think evidence holds it up, I do believe that time is a mesh. It's not a straight line, and that what you do, like these series of events that occur, I mean, and the idea of time being a mesh fits totally in with relativity. In fact, I dare say if I said it to Carlo Rovelli, he'd probably agree, even though it might be somewhat different from what he's exactly describing. But that what you do in space-time, can affect, not like a butterfly effect, but anyway, affects all the other events, as Carlo Rovelli would call them, within this mesh. And so a spiral is, this is where some people say, oh, well, the spiral is like a labyrinth thing and it's talking about the journey through life and all that. That might be getting close to the mark, but I really think that it represents time. And I think that the reason why you may see multiple of them being carved or drawn at certain points, or why they're put into headdresses on religious figures and things like this, is because it's showing it may be like a very basic calendar. That while time is a mesh, there are so many meshes, shall we say, that you go through. And it was a first attempt at maybe tracking time, much like, a prisoner perhaps will mark the days, with a scratch on the wall of his cell. Of course, that's a tragic example, but you get my point. And how did our ancient ancestors recognize that time was some kind of mesh and that life was just a series of events and things and not something that necessarily gets measured? Well, I think that and I've talked about this many times, I think our ancient ancestors were so reliant, they had to be so in touch with reality, with what's around them, with the objective reality around them, because if they didn't, they died. Okay, so it was a matter of absolute survival, that they were aware and, had kept a very close eye on, just the cycles of things. Going through the seasons, all this stuff. And it all always kind of came back. It all always, the earth kept on. Winter would come and winter would go. Then winter would come back and all that. And so it was all a spiral. It wasn't a straight line that went on forever. It was a spiral. It was cyclical, what was going on. And I think it was their representation of time. And I think that even in just that basic staring at nature, they were able to figure out that time is a mesh, and that time, maybe these concepts of past, present, future, aren't exactly things, again, outside of, say, the second law of thermodynamics, which they didn't know that, but I'm sure that to some degree they were, seeing entropy happen before them in ways. I could picture it, that they would come up with the concept of time. And they would recognize the importance of time. Which is why they would make, so many of their monolithic structures would seem to be based around not necessarily measuring time, but being at least aware. You could call that measuring, but I think of being aware of when certain events were going to happen, etc. I think it points at that humans had this understanding of much of, not saying 100%, but much of what Carlo Rovelli was talking about. And merely through simple observation, and that they started to use it, very basically, and to draw about it and talk about it very basically using the spiral symbol. It is the symbol of time, which maybe they also recognized as death and other things happen, just how important time is. That's kind of my theory on that. But I think it's interesting that, and that's a theory I've held for quite some time, both the theory that time is a mesh, and that the petroglyphs of spirals were representative of time. Now, again, neither of those things are exactly what's being laid, or certainly not the petroglyphs. They're not talked about at all. Neither of those things are what are brought up in Carlo Rovelli's Order of Time. But I do think that the ideas meld together, or mesh together perhaps, very nicely. So check it out, give it a listen, and if you think I'm wrong about anything, or if you wanna ask questions about it, feel free. I can get into it in a Wednesday Patreon-only Q&A. That'd be a lot of fun. Or if you want it for a Prime episode, we can get into it there. I love talking about this stuff. Science is especially physics, is a very deep passion for me. If I had, I say this all the time. I give the three things that I am. Number one, I'm a gamer. First and foremost, I'm a gamer. Number two, I'm a historian. Armchair, but I'm a historian. Number three, I'm a tech journalist. Number four, I'd probably be a physicist. or a programmer. I'd be a cryptographer, I guess. I don't. Well, anyway, that's a whole other life. So. But I love this stuff, and I love getting to talk about it. And there are so many wild books that are coming out right now, especially because, I mean, there's so many new theories. I mean, just the way that information can travel so quickly now, science is moving. I often hate using that term in such an abstract way, but really, science is moving at a rapid pace. I mean, really, really rapid. And there's so many wild and exciting things going on, and we're discovering so much every day. Well, anyway, I could get into a bunch of that, but I won't. So I'll leave you with that. There you go. Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli. There's a link in the show notes if you want to get your hands on it, which goes through the Sex and Science Hour or stuff.sexandsciencehour link, and feel free to check it out. Again, I just think it's a stunning read and gives you some tremendous history of events that, if you haven't heard of them, if you never heard those stories, they're well worth hearing alone, whether you agree with Rovelli's conclusions or lack thereof at points or not. So anyway, that's it for this episode. I'm going to wrap this up right here, and you have more content coming out this week, of course. I will see all of you on the other side.